Good afternoon. Welcome to Macquarie University Liberal Club Sunday Sessions podcast, live from the Facebook main page. My name is Andrew Cremon, filling in for Scott Morrison, and I'm joined as always by Lachlan Burke.
Thanks, good to be with you.
Good to have you on. After telling 2GB that he couldn't recall, Scott Morrison has admitted to secret appointments in various cabinet positions as Treasurer in the Departments of Health, Finance, Home Affairs, and Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. What were the reasons behind this? Is it even constitutional? Xavier Boffa, Executive Director at the Samuel Griffith Society, is here to join us to speak more about it. Xavier, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me on the show, Andrew.
It's a pleasure to have you. So, as always, you can ask your questions in the comment section, and we'll try to ask as many of them within the hour to Xavier as possible. Firstly, tell us what the Australian Constitution represents, and where does the Samuel Griffith Society come into this?
Thanks, Andrew. Well, the Samuel Griffith Society is named after one of the most consequential founders of the nation Australia as we now know it, Samuel Griffith, who was the primary author of the Constitution and also the first Chief Justice of Australia. So the Society today exists to continue to promote Sir Samuel's legacy, the Constitution and everything it stands for. And I think you asked, what does the Constitution actually stand for? Well, to me, I think the fundamental bedrock principles of our system of government that the Constitution represents are principles such as the rule of law, the separation of powers, responsible government, and also, importantly, and particularly, I think we've seen this play out in recent years during the COVID pandemic, the federal compact that the leaders and subsequently the people of the different colonies in Australia agreed in the convention debates leading into 1900.
Could you talk a bit more about the issue of federalism and how it plays into Morrison taking multiple portfolios? Do you think the National Cabinet aim to fulfill the promise of leaving decisions to the states?
Look, I think putting aside the very unique circumstances of the pandemic, the fundamental question, I think, where it concerns federalism or federal state relations in Australia over the last 100 years has always been whether decisions should be made centrally in Canberra by a small group of people, or whether, as far as possible, decisions should be made more locally and power should be diffuse. So spread out to the states and even beyond that to even more local levels of government where appropriate. So obviously we need to have a federal government to do things like run the national defence, to manage the borders, to administer those sorts of areas. But I think, part of the question is, do we really need a federal government to be dictating health or education policy when they don't run schools and, barring one exception in Tasmania, they don't run any hospitals? I think that's the divide. In terms of the National Cabinet, I think that was a unique and interesting development because it saw, on one hand, a lot of the usual processes bypassed, and in one way, centralisation of decision making, but also at the same time, the pandemic saw us paying much closer attention to our state governments and saw state premiers take on a much more highly visible role. So I think in some respects, it has put pressure on our federal system, but in other ways, it's actually demonstrated the significance of Australian federalism and actually demonstrated the power that the states do exercise. And I think that has been an important learning or educating moment for the public.
Are you arguing then that the positions, or say the Department of Health, that there was only a limited amount that Scott Morrison could even do in such a position?
Well, that's right to a certain extent. So obviously the federal government has power over things like quarantine at the border. But you're right. I think part of the reason why the infrastructure, such as national cabinet and the associated entities, was necessary was because, as we saw at various points during the pandemic, without the agreement of the states, the federal government actually didn't have a lot of power to force state government to do certain things. So you could have someone like Mark McGowan decide to unilaterally close the border into Western Australia because that is fundamentally within the capacity of the states to do. And so I think if you look at things from a practical standpoint, it was necessary to try and engage with state premiers and state governments because the federal government doesn't have all of the powers necessary to enforce certain measures. Now, that I think is probably actually a good thing, because if you think about, I mean, I'm a Victorian, and so suffered through what are probably the world's longest lockdowns with my fellow Victorians. I don't think you would want a single person in Canberra being able to impose those sorts of restrictions upon every single Australian without any sort of negotiation or compromise building, just because Daniel Andrews or someone like him happened to be the Prime Minister of Australia. So I think that's something that's important to remember also.
Hmm. Well, what role so far are we aware of? What role did Scott Morrison play in the various portfolios that he assumed?
Well, I guess we don't really know, and I think when I was asked to come on the program, I didn't, as was probably the case for everyone except maybe Scott Morrison, didn't have any inclination that this might be something that we would be talking about, because it is quite unprecedented, what has been revealed in recent days. So the short answer is we don't quite know. But look, if we take things at face value, what's been said publicly, what's been revealed publicly, it doesn't appear that Scott Morrison actually exercised any of the powers that he had when he was sworn in as a sort of a second health minister. It doesn't look like he actually did exercise any of those powers. I think the argument that has been made is that those steps were taken as more of a precautionary measure. But look, we don't know, and I think that's perhaps part of what has attracted a lot of public scrutiny of this decision, is that there's probably no way that we will ever know the full truth of it.
What role do you think the Governor General played, and what kind of responsibility do you think he has for making this sharing of portfolios possible?
Well, certainly in a technical respect, the Governor General was the one that made it possible, because he is the one that appointed Scott Morrison to these various portfolios. So, from a completely sort of technical standpoint, that is how things sit. However, if you look more broadly at convention, it's very rare for a Governor General or a governor to push back against the advice of a Prime Minister or a Premier. And so I don't think that the criticism in this particular instance should be directed at the Governor General. I think if there are concerns that people have or questions that need to be answered, I think really that does come down to the advice that the Prime Minister has given to the Governor General in respect to the making of those appointments. And there is an interesting legal question that I don't think anyone has a complete answer to yet, about whether the Governor General, in the exercise of the reserve powers of the Crown under the Constitution, could, just unilaterally decide to fully disregard the advice of the Prime Minister. I mean, I think that probably the answer is yes, they could, but there's a lot of controversy around it. The only real example that we have of a Governor General doing something like that is the Whitlam dismissal, and that is obviously still controversial, although I personally would say it was well within his rights at the time. So yes, probably the Governor General in this instance could have said, no, I'm not going to do this, but that would have been quite remarkable even for him to do that.
So, looking at, I think it's Section 64 of the Constitution, the Governor General may appoint officers to administer such departments of state of the Commonwealth as the Governor General in Council may establish. So establishes the power, but it doesn't actually mention that he has to he has to tell the nation. So who is in charge of telling the nation about any appointment by the Governor General?
Well, I think if you look at that as a political question, I think it really is incumbent upon the government to make those decisions, right? The Prime Minister and Cabinet to make those decisions, because I think the critical phrase there is the Governor General in Council. So when we're talking about the Executive Council, that's actually primarily made up of politicians, senior members of the government who are elected MPs. So I think in terms of the concept of responsible government, political accountability, I think that is something that rests on the shoulders of our elected members of Parliament. I think if there was a reason why these arrangements were necessary or thought to be necessary, which there may very well be, we don't necessarily have the full story, then I think that the responsibility for deciding how, when, in what forums to convey that to the public rests on the politicians, not the Governor General, because the Governor General's role is supposed to be quite limited. We don't have a presidential system where you can have one person by presidential edicts making all sorts of decisions, exercising all sorts of power. It's a system of checks and balances where power is separated between the politicians and the Crown as a check on power. So I think, I've seen some criticism of what's happened here along the lines that too much power was placed in the Prime Minister's hands by swearing him into all these different portfolios. I don't think the answer to that problem, if you think that is a problem, is then to say, well, let's get rid of the Crown and the system of checks and balances and have a president, if that makes sense, which I've seen some people suggest that this somehow exposes the weakness of our current system of government, our current constitutional monarchy. I don't agree with that, because I think that this actually demonstrates why it's important to have these checks and balances. But I think also, just finally, on the provision that you were reading out before, I think a lot of people, certainly members of the public, might not appreciate that there is no constitutional health minister or even prime minister. The Constitution says there will be ministers, they'll administer departments, but it doesn't say there's going to be a health minister, there's going to be a foreign minister, there's going to be XYZ ministers. So the idea that there could be two health ministers is not in any way contradictory to the words or intent of the Constitution. And in fact, we've had a number of, for quite some time, number of departments administered by multiple ministers. So the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is a very good example where you have several cabinet ministers, the Minister for Trade as well as the Foreign Minister, who jointly administer the department. So in terms of legally, it's completely consistent with the wording and intent of the Constitution for there to be multiple ministers exercising powers in the same sphere or administering the same department. But I think the bigger question here is around transparency.
Well, he mentioned that it was as a precaution, especially if a certain minister gets knocked out by COVID, which certainly in the early stages was very much a mysterious illness. Boris Johnson, he referenced he had to be put on a ventilator, and furthermore, he also mentioned that most of the cabinet so they're junior ministers, and so as such, it seemed to me that it wouldn't be appropriate for them to be appointed to various other departments. As such, it all fell to him. Looking at his background, of course, he was treasurer, so you'd understand that he may be part of finance. Health would be sort of what was to do with the pandemic. Home affairs is right up his alley, and furthermore, he had a bachelor's degree majoring in economic geography. So industry, science, energy, and resources, in a sense, makes sense. But why was he the only one appointed to multiple positions? Because if he got COVID, he would, especially early on, he would be someone who would be considered to be at risk.
This should give you an answer to that question. I can only speculate based on what's been stated publicly and what we know. It is a good question, I think, And there's also a question, I think, around if that's the stated reason that there were concerns that ministers might be out of action due to the virus, why the usual sorts of measures that we have in the past used when senior ministers, even prime ministers, have been, for one reason or another, incapacitated. It's not like it's difficult to swear someone into a new responsibility at fairly short notice without having any pre-existing arrangements in place. So, I think there are some interesting questions there. I can't definitively say yes or no, there was or wasn't a good reason for it, because I'm not in a position where I know all of the things that the Prime Minister and his department were aware of in terms of the management of the pandemic. But certainly, I think there is a legitimate question there about why did we need to take these additional precautions in advance in anticipation of something going wrong, rather than being able to respond in the usual sort of manner if something did in fact go wrong. But I also think that the question you ask about why weren't others also sworn in this way is a fair question. I can't, as I say, can't really offer more than speculation as to the answer. Maybe it was done this way because they understood that if the Prime Minister were incapacitated, then they could quickly swear someone else into his responsibilities. I don't know. I'd just be guessing.
Could you tell us a bit more about the Biosecurity Act of 2015 and why it played such a decisive role during the pandemic?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing to bear in mind, as I mentioned before, is that the Commonwealth has only limited powers to make laws and regulations. One of those areas that's stated in the Constitution in Section 51 is quarantine. And the Biosecurity Act is an act of Parliament that was enacted under that quarantine head of power. So the Commonwealth can only make laws with respect to the areas that it's been granted power by the Constitution. And in order to try and exercise power into other areas, it's got to do so in sort of more inventive ways. So either with the agreement of the states through a conferral of powers, or through sort of an inventive expansion, if you will, of its own power. So I think a lot of the public health powers really are properly exercised by the states under our federal system. But clearly, quarantine being an issue of national concern and being expressly granted to the Commonwealth in the Constitution, falls squarely within the Commonwealth power. Right? So I think that's why the Biosecurity Act has played an important role, is because it's one of the only tools that the Commonwealth had access to in terms of trying to manage the pandemic. So the Commonwealth can't put people into lockdown, they can't mandate people wear masks, things like that. But what they can do is they can shut the borders. And that has happened in the past. So it's not totally unprecedented. So there was a period about 100 years ago during the Spanish flu outbreak where similar measures were entered into by the Commonwealth to shut the borders and to try and contain the problem, or to keep the problem out, as it were, using the Biosecurity Act or its equivalent at the time. So that's, I think, why it has been quite significant. But a lot of the measures that people would be most familiar with from the pandemic actually had nothing to do with the Biosecurity Act. And it, in fact, had nothing to do with the Commonwealth at all. They were state powers being exercised by the different state governments.
How much of a time limit exists on the emergency powers from each state?
Well, it varies.
Yep.
It varies from state to state. And in fact, some states, such as my home state of Victoria, have actually introduced new laws in the last year or two to change their pandemic arrangements to give governments more power. So in Victoria, you had a situation where the laws prior to COVID enabled for state of emergencies and similar declarations to be declared, but they had to be renewed by Parliament every few months. But the Andrews government in Victoria actually legislated to give itself more power to extend those states of emergency and so forth for longer periods of time with less parliamentary scrutiny. So the short answer is it varies between states. Victoria is still under some of those measures. Off the top of my head, I would have to check, but I believe that there are other states that are as well. But I also understand that New South Wales is not anymore under the same measures. One of your viewers might be able to correct me on that, being based in New South Wales. But my understanding is that for some states, those measures are still in place technically, and for others, they've ceased entirely.
We've seen this described as a presidential styled action on behalf of Scott Morrison. What conventions of the Westminster system were seemingly discarded?
Yeah, so I think, I mentioned this before, that one of the criticisms of what's been revealed is that it seemed to concentrate a lot of power into the Prime Minister and make him more of a presidential figure. I think I mentioned before that I don't think that this set of events highlights a weakness in our system. I think it actually demonstrates a strength of our system, because under a presidential system, there would be nobody who would have any ability to exercise any oversight over the president or the Prime Minister. Whereas in this instance, the Governor General did have reserve powers, although he didn't choose to exercise them here. But I think part of the reason why it was not necessary to consider that is, as far as we know, there was only one exercise of power under these arrangements in the resources portfolio. Other than that, there appear, and look, this may change as we learn more, but it appears as though there were no other exercises of power. And certainly, if there had been other exercises of power, I think we would have seen some evidence of that. We probably would know if Scott Morrison, as Health Minister or as a minister administering the Department of Health, had actually done anything in those roles. So I think it certainly is a departure from convention, but I don't think that it actually has weakened or undermined the system in the way that some people on Twitter seem to be suggesting. Because, as I say, it doesn't look like there were any major actions taken. If there were, then the Governor General would have had the ability to step in and do something about it. He hasn't, but perhaps it seems that is because there was no need for him to do so. That's my take on it as things currently stand. But look, we may learn more in the coming days and weeks that could change that. But at this stage, it doesn't look like really there's been any real exercise of those powers.
Well, we learned that there was one instance where Morrison used the resources ministry to apparently override a gas drilling project. Do you think that that was within his right?
Well, look, I think in terms of the legal question, he was sworn in as a minister administering those portfolios, so it was within his rights. I think that raises questions. I don't think that I understand why it was necessary for him to do that in that way, and why it couldn't have been done in consultation with Keith Pitt, who was the relevant minister at the time. So, look, that's something I don't understand. There may or may not be good reasons for it that we're not aware of, but certainly it's puzzling to me, I will say that. However, he was totally within his rights legally. Politically, I think it's a different question. I think it's strange that it needed to be done. I was talking to a former member of our Defence Force recently, and sort of, the topic came up, and we were having some discussion about why these particular portfolios, and he had made the point that, look, resources is such a critical element of our national security, that perhaps that was some of the thinking. I don't know. I can only speculate, as I said before, but it does seem strange. So I think politically there is a real question there about why that was necessary. But certainly from a legal standpoint, uh, there's no sort of breach of the law um, involved in that exercise of the power, although there are potentially legal questions or uncertainties that exist when you've got two ministers with the same or ostensibly the same powers that could, in theory, exercise those powers concurrently but in divergent ways. That could open up some legal questions, but I don't think that those questions really arise on these facts as they are at the moment.
Do you think it was hypothetically possible for a member of the public to find out this information? To give you an example from France, Emmanuel Macron changed the tinge of blue on the French flag to better match the blue that was used during the French Revolution, and this went unnoticed by the public for 18 months. So is it
Yeah, I
theoretically
mean,
possible?
look, who knows? I mean, you've got some very effective sleuths on the internet that can figure things out just based on
Mm.
very, very seemingly innocuous details. So, it's possible. But at the same time, it's entirely possible that this may never have been revealed. Um, I mean, there would have been people in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, presumably, that would have known. Obviously, the Prime Minister and the Governor General, presumably, some of the Governor General staff would have known. Um, but these are all people in highly trusted positions who generally can be trusted to keep confidences. And look, as I say, there may be a really good reason for all of this that we just don't know about, and it may have some national security implication that you know it's not appropriate for the public to know about at this stage. That might be the case. I'm not suggesting that that is the case, because it's also equally possible that there is no such reason, and that there was no good, strong, compelling reason for these arrangements. I just can't say, given what we know at the moment.
I guess I'm just trying to think. I suppose maybe that's something for the audience to answer. If there is actually a theoretical way to discover these things, if no one actually announces them, we do have an audience question here. Did the Governor General do the right thing?
Well, look, again, as I said before, I don't think that the Governor General deserves criticism for what's going on here, at least on the facts as we currently understand them. So I will sort of reiterate that caveat. This is something that's evolving, and there were a number of days where new revelations were being made each day, and new revelations could certainly change my position on this. But I don't think the Governor General is the one that really should be held to account politically here. I think that's a bit of a misdirection. I do think the political responsibility for this decision rests with the Prime Minister, or the then Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. And I think if there are political questions to be answered, I think it's him that needs to answer them. Now, he has offered some explanation uh, via the press and via social media in the last few days. Whether people think that that explanation stacks up is really, I suppose, a matter for them. But he's still a member of Parliament. Um, the principle of responsible government still applies to him equally as to any other member of Parliament and any other member of government, and certainly any other head of government. And I think that if this was something that was well justified, then um, it's incumbent on him to provide that justification, not the Governor General. It may be, as I alluded to before, that now is not an appropriate time to give that full justification, because there might be some live issues of national security that might complicate things. And if that's the case, it's sort of, I suppose, a dark night scenario where Scott Morrison just has to bear the brunt of the criticism for the good of the country. I mean, that's sort of the role you sign up to when you enter Parliament, and certainly when you lead a government. People might not be able to understand the reason why you did certain things when you did them based on the information that is publicly available at the time. But that's just part of it. You've got to deal with that.
Do you believe, I think you've mentioned one of the justifications that's been brought out is that it was a developing situation. The government didn't know how serious the pandemic was going to turn out to be. Could you expand a bit on whether you think that's a valid reason given the facts as we know them now?
Yeah, look, I mean, given what we know now, I still have the question in my mind about whether the usual sorts of arrangements that can be entered into when a minister or even a prime minister is incapacitated for one reason or another, why those would have been insufficient. I mean, we've had prime ministers serving in office who've died in the past, and the system didn't collapse. We were able to enter into usual arrangements, swear people in. The Governor General can swear someone in as a minister, in any portfolio really at very short notice. So, look, that is a question in my mind, but perhaps there were good reasons. I'm not aware of any specific reasons why that usual approach couldn't have applied. I don't know what sort of briefings the Prime Minister was getting, whether he was getting different briefings as a result of having these additional portfolio responsibilities that he wouldn't have otherwise have been getting as Prime Minister. It's all really speculation, I suppose. But at its face, given what we know now, I'm not sure that it does totally stack up. But as I say, that's something that I think will be better placed to judge when we know more about the reasoning, we know more about what happened. And I think also to the previous question, Andrew, about people finding out, I suppose the best way that we could have found out is if he'd actually exercised those powers. So in the absence of having exercised those powers, I think it's probably harder for us to have found out about it without it being announced. But certainly without it having been announced, if he'd been doing things in those portfolios, making decisions beyond the one that we know about now, that probably would have been a way that people could have found out. I think that relates back to this question, in that if we take it at face value, it was totally precautionary and he was never intending to use the powers, then maybe it's not really that significant an issue. I don't think that it's an issue that undermines our democracy, as some have suggested. Given that the powers weren't exercised and that there's no prohibition on this sort of thing in our constitution. And certainly, I mean, we change the composition of the ministry and of cabinet all the time. We create new ministries, we dissolve ministries, we change the composition of departments and their responsibilities all the time. That's quite normal, and it's normal, as I said before, for two ministers, including two senior cabinet ministers, to be administering the same department and a lot of the same laws, therefore.
Well, we could say that it hasn't perhaps legally caused any kind of constitutional crisis, but do you think that it may set a dangerous precedent for future prime ministers exercising different kinds of power?
Yes, certainly. I don't know whether I'd go so far as to say dangerous precedent, but what I would say probably is that I don't think that it would be justified for this to become commonplace. I don't see any value in this being a common practice going forward. I think it's broadly accepted that the COVID pandemic was a once in a century type event, and that government responses to the pandemic were or should be seen within that context. So for this to become something that happens every time there's any sort of crisis, I think would be a potentially problematic development. Although, as I say, we haven't really seen any harm that has been the result of these arrangements. And certainly, if they were purely precautionary and did not result in any exercise of power outside the usual processes, then it's difficult to get too upset about that. But in terms of a practice going forward, I think you would want them to be pretty limited, if at all, because I think there is a principle of responsible government in the Constitution. I think most people would expect to know who the ministers responsible for which departments administering which laws are, who the opposition holds to account in question time and other members of parliament hold to account in question time, who members of the public can contact to hold them to account, those sorts of things. I mean, I think if you have this whole concept of another term, shadow ministries has been used, or something to that effect has been used. I think if you had that as a widespread practice, it would undermine that principle of responsible government, definitely.
Are you aware of any literature where this was theorized as possible? because someone came up with this. Someone invented it. It looks like it's been localized to the Liberal Party, and we don't know how long they've sat on this.
Yeah, a great question, Andrew. I'm not aware of any literature or any writing about this particular um, use of the um, provisions of the Constitution to sort of affect this sort of arrangement. Certainly, it's well within, as far as I'm concerned, the um, the text and also the spirit of the Constitution. Um, as I alluded to before, I mean, our understanding of what a minister is has, in some respects, evolved over time. Um, you know, we used to have ministers for things that we don't anymore, and we have ministers now for things that we didn't before because there's no set list enumerated anywhere in the Constitution or otherwise that says these are the ministers that we're going to have, these are the departments that we're going to have. The allocation of portfolios to ministers and the creation of departments is a purely administrative arrangement. It's sort of within the machinery of government, whereas the Constitution just says there will be ministers who will advise the Queen through the Governor General as the vice-regal representative. So I think having that understanding, this sort of arrangement does, from one perspective, make some sense. If you view ministers as just being essentially advisors to the Governor General on behalf of the Queen, that from time to time are appointed to portfolios. I mean, in the past, it was much more common for ministers to be appointed without portfolio, both at the state and federal levels. You would have ministers sitting in cabinet without portfolio, and they were referred to as such. So that's not anything new. But certainly, I think in terms of the public understanding of how the system works and public perception, which I think is equally as important here as the legal questions in this context, political context, I think that this is something which people wouldn't expect.
Do you believe that this will damage Scott Morrison's legacy, and do you think he may resign as the situation develops and more information becomes public?
Look, I think that's probably, although there are probably a lot of people on Twitter that hope that will be the case, I think that's probably a bit of a stretch because it doesn't appear that there has been any wrongdoing on the part of Scott Morrison or anyone else in this scenario. I mean, putting aside there maybe some questions around that one decision in the resources portfolio, and questions about why that was done in that way. Putting that to one side, based on what we know currently, it doesn't look like Scott Morrison actually did anything that was questionable through these arrangements. So I think the arrangements themselves, this is not a sort of Watergate scenario. I don't think this is the sort of thing that someone needs to resign over. But look, that might change as more is revealed. Certainly in terms of his legacy, I think it comes back to what I was saying before. I think history will judge Scott Morrison's prime ministership and the Morrison government with the facts that are available to it in the future. So, there may very well, as I've said a few times, be really good justifications for these arrangements that we can't know now, but that we might know in the future. And I think that will inform history's assessment of Scott Morrison's prime ministership. But equally, it might be that those justifications just don't exist, and therefore that they're never revealed. And in fact, that other things are revealed that do change our understanding of this and could tarnish his legacy, I suppose. But certainly, based on what we know now, I don't think it makes a difference one way or the other personally, as much as there's been a lot of outrage on social media, particularly on Twitter.
Well, if I can latch on to something you said earlier, where you said that it's within the spirit of the Constitution, how is this? Because we do have an audience question about what is the significance of the secrecy factor. I'm not trying to get you to retread old ground, but how is it like? How is this? I suppose you could say legally it wasn't a secret.
Yeah, so I think for me, the secrecy, the transparency element of it, politically, is the most significant element of this, what some would call a scandal, right? I think that's the biggest issue, personally, from my perspective. why didn't the government come out and say, look, this is an unprecedented pandemic, and so this is what we're going to do. We're just letting everyone know that we're going to swear the Prime Minister in as Health Minister as well as Greg Hunt, and et cetera, et cetera. And why not just lay it out to us? Because I don't think if they'd done that, many people would have been that upset by it. I don't think many people would have said, hang on a second, this is just outrageous. How can we have two health ministers? I think most people, if they had done that, would have said, yeah, that makes sense. It doesn't seem like it's going to create any problems if he's just doing it as a backup. I think there might have been some legal questions within sort of legal academia about some of the implications if certain things had happened, but that would have been an interesting discussion, nothing more. So for me, not knowing all the facts, I do wonder, why didn't they just tell us? But that's why I keep coming back to this thing. I know this is sort of, I don't want it to be a crutch, because I do want to give these questions the sort of full consideration they deserve. But I do keep coming back to this question of, well, there might be a reason that we don't know about and that it's not appropriate for us to know about. But as I said before, that's not an excuse, I think, for Scott Morrison, because I think, as a public servant, you take that on. Sometimes you have to bear the brunt of public criticism, and that there was a good reason, but that you can't tell people, and that's just part of it. But no, I think to come back to the question, I think the secrecy element politically is quite significant, and probably the most significant element in my mind. Legally, the secrecy element, I think, could potentially be an issue or could potentially have led to issues, but I don't really think is of that much consequence personally from a legal perspective, more so politically.
Do you believe that there should be a royal commission into this issue and generally the federal and state leaders' handling of the pandemic? Because we know there are also emergency powers exercised in Victoria very extensively.
Yeah, look, I think generally with respect to royal commissions, I think there has been a tendency in recent years to have a royal commission into every single issue of public concern. I think royal commissions are a very important tool, but they should be used properly. And they're not the only tool. So you can have parliamentary inquiries, into things, and then you can as a result of those inquiries, then build a case for a royal commission into a particular thing. But I think having a royal commission into every single issue is probably overdoing it. Personally, that's my personal view. Now, in terms of these specific issues, I think the suggestion that there should be a royal commission into these sort of secrecy ministries or secret ministries, shadow ministries, whatever you want to call them, is probably overblown, given what's currently known publicly. It just doesn't seem like there's been this great wrongdoing that would justify the resources of a royal commission. If Labor wants to do that, if the Albanese government wants to do that, then good luck to them, I suppose. You only have so much time in government and so much that you get to do as a government. And if that's what you want to use your time in government to do, to prosecute a case against a former prime minister who's not even the leader of the Liberal Party anymore, is just a backbencher, then good luck to them, I suppose. But I personally, as yet, don't see the case for a royal commission. Certainly, I'm not saying that this shouldn't be investigated and that people shouldn't be asking legitimate questions about whether there were any other exercise of the power, whether there was any wrongdoing. Because I'm not saying there was no wrongdoing. I'm just saying that we have no evidence of any wrongdoing. As concerns state governments, again, I think you've got to have a good reason for having a royal commission into something. I think in Victoria, it's a fairly unique circumstance because a lot of people died, ostensibly because of failures of government in terms of the awarding of contracts to security personnel, and other sort of government actions or inactions. And I think there was an inquiry into the Victorian arrangements to do with hotel quarantine, and there were a lot of questions that remain unanswered as a result of that inquiry, the Coate inquiry. So I think in the case of Victoria, although I personally would not be advocating for or against a royal commission in Victoria, I do think it's a slightly different set of circumstances because you had the Coate inquiry, questions were asked. There was a lot of, I don't recall, there were a lot of creeping assumptions. So there was a lot of that, and that Coate inquiry just wasn't able to get to the heart of the truth of what happened. And as I say, hundreds of people died. So perhaps there is more of a case for a royal commission into Victoria's pandemic response. But as I say, I mean, I think the idea that royal commissions are sort of this panacea that they just solve every issue is wrong, because royal commissions are just about fact finding, and you've got to actually, I think, look at what would we do differently in the future? What changes to Victoria's pandemic laws, for instance, should we make? What changes to the way that the Department of Jobs handled those contracts should be changed? So, those are the more important questions for me personally, rather than just looking at sort of assigning blame as to what happened in the past. Let's look at what we should be doing next time. What are the lessons we should learn?
Hmm. I'm noticing that we're running out of time. What are some of the virtues of the Australian Constitution that the public should be aware of if something like a pandemic ever happens again?
Well, I think that the virtues of the Constitution and of the Federal Compact were highlighted in the pandemic. You know, although personally, I have my own views, and probably everyone has their own views about this. West Australians, for instance, seem to have loved the fact that Mark McGowan shut the borders and that they avoided lockdown for most of the last 2 years. I remember seeing on social media, friends in WA and in Queensland who were living life as if it was just normal times, while we were suffering through lockdown with helicopters flying overhead and curfews, being permitted outside for only an hour a day here in Melbourne. And, I can see how from their perspective, they're pretty happy that it wasn't a national response along the same lines as Victoria's response. So I think for those people, you should be thankful that we have a federal system of government where the states have rights and they have powers, and it's not just all decided centrally by someone in Canberra. So, although politically I might not have agreed with the decision of some of these governments, and as I'm sure many of your members probably don't agree with the decisions of some of these state governments, I think we've got to also think about the counterfactual. Would you have wanted Daniel Andrews making decisions for the whole country and imposing lockdown on the whole country for almost 300 days? I think most people would say probably not. So I think that is a virtue. That being said, I do think that the Constitution sets out a system and we don't fully follow that system. So over the last 100 years, through successive High Court decisions, through restructurings of arrangements in Canberra and between the states and the Commonwealth, we've shifted away from the original intention of the founders, and we have become a much more centralised system. And so I think that the pandemic also shows that there's a need to reinvest in our constitution, to reinvigorate our federalism, and to reassert some of the intentions of the founders in designing the system as they did. Because I think that if that were the case, there are some provisions of the Constitution that have been, I think, underutilised, and perhaps their meaning has been watered down. I think Section 92, as it relates to intercourse between the states and border closures, is an example of that. And I think that people should, although they should view the federalist aspect of it, I think positively, given the outcomes, I think they should also view it as an opportunity to say, we've actually drifted a long way from what was intended, and we'd be even better off if we went back to that original intention.
We know that the Constitution is a bit more malleable here in Australia, a bit weaker than it is in the United States. Do you think that there are any changes that could be made to make the system more robust against future crises?
Yeah, I think for us, the situation is different from the United States because they have a Bill of Rights enshrined in their constitution, whereas Australia's constitution is very mechanical. So it doesn't outline rights for people, for citizens. It just delineates the power of the different branches of government and the different levels of government. That being said, there are some pretty clear prohibitions like that Section 92 prohibition that I mentioned before, and others like it, on the ability of Australian governments to do certain things that I think have been watered down, as I said before, over the last century. So I think in terms of future pandemics, if you wanted to look at things like cross-border movement, which I think is very foreign to most of us who live in capital cities. But if you live in a border community, if you live in Albury or Wodonga, or if you live in regional New South Wales close to the Queensland border, a lot of the things that most of us take for granted that you access in terms of daily services or essential services are actually cross-border. So for people in those communities, I think their rights at certain points in the pandemic were really trampled on because something as simple as going to the shops, let alone something as important as getting to hospital, was severely impacted by the restriction on travel across borders. And Section 92 is pretty clear. Intercourse between the states will be absolutely free. Absolutely free is not a particularly ambiguous term. But there's been a lot of jurisprudence over the last 100 years that has changed the meaning of absolutely free from what I think people would have ordinarily understood it to be. So I think that's one aspect of it. That being said, in terms of other issues, in terms of the pandemic response, I personally am very cautious about bills of rights. And I think if you look closely at the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, and you look at the way that it was and wasn't used during the pandemic, because that's effectively a Bill of Rights, although it's not sort of constitutionally enshrined per se, it's effectively a Bill of Rights. If you look at how that was and wasn't used in the pandemic by judges in Victoria to scrutinise or to provide oversight over government actions, I think it demonstrates that just putting things into the Constitution, just saying, that people have a right to go to the shops and, or whatever, have a right to free movement. Just putting that into a document is not enough to guarantee those rights will be respected. I think what's actually more important is having limitations on the power of whether it's health minister, chief health officer, or whomever, ensuring there's proper parliamentary oversight. So ensuring that state of emergencies need to be constantly reviewed by Parliament and renewed, rather than just giving sort of carte blanche to the government to just do whatever it likes for an indefinite period of time because there is a pandemic. I mean, we all want to stop people from dying, right? No one is saying that we shouldn't try and protect people's lives, but it's, I think, a furphy to say that you can't protect people's lives and also have accountability. So I think building in those accountability mechanisms and actually ensuring that government powers are properly limited with proper oversight is way more important than sort of just saying, oh, we'll have a Bill of Rights and that will solve all the problems.
Well, we are out of time. Xavier Boffa, Executive Director at the Samuel Griffith Society, thank you so much for coming on to Sunday Sessions. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks very much, Lachlan. It's been great to chat with you both. And thanks to all your members who tuned in and who will tune in subsequently. Thanks for the great questions.
Thank you. This has been a Macquarie University Liberal Club production. My name is Andrew Crummon. I've been joined by Lachlan Burke. We will see you next week. Goodbye.